Government has insisted that the increase in whale deaths off the East Coast has no relationship to the wind industry's high decibel pile driving and boat activity. But now, according to friend of the show Michael Shellenberger, a new documentary will challenge that notion.
Here's a clip of Thrown to the Wind, a public production.
There aren't many places where the North Atlantic right whale can go. It's destined to extinction.
It sounds like they're like also like pile driving.
This is what the whale is experiencing when they come out of nowhere.
What the United States is looking at is thousands of wind turbines in an area that our whales, our dolphins, our marine life, where they live, where they migrate, where they breed. It's only when they started going into the wind lease areas that we believe that the whales are dying.
So those red dots are whale deaths.
Precisely.
What a scandal.
Here to delve more into this issue is investigative journalist Michael Shellenberger, who helped research and produce this documentary that is being released today. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks for having me.
So what is the argument, the causal argument that between whale deaths and the introduction of these wind turbines?
Sure, there's basically two mechanisms that we think are causing the whale deaths. The first is there's boat traffic in areas where there has not historically been boat traffic. And we know that whales tend to hide from the boats. They know that they're a threat and they avoid them. And so when you add new boat traffic to areas that had been previously untrafficked, you're going to get more boat strikes, which are one of the leading causes of death, if not the leading cause of death. The second mechanism is that loud noise that you hear, which is sonar mapping of the ocean floor. Eventually, will be pile driving to build those wind turbines. The whales run away from those sounds. They're frightened of those sounds. We know that mothers and their calves can split apart and go into feeding less places where there's not as many fish for feeding. They can also make them tired to run away from that, and also can push them into areas where there's a lot of boat traffic. So there's two very well-known mechanisms for how these activities would cause deaths. And the government has been saying that they've been researching this, and we have shown that they've not been researching it, or they have been researching it and discovered what we discovered, which means they've been covering it up, either of which is a scandal, because they've been reassuring the public that they've been looking into this. We go out on the first boat trip out with an acoustic specialist, and he drops the hydrophone, which is the underwater microphone, into the water, and they discover these unbelievably loud levels, high decibel sounds for sonar tracking. So I think it's a major environmental scandal. I think it's the biggest environmental scandal I've ever worked on in 30 years of environmental advocacy. We are already talking to members of Congress about hearings on this. We need subpoena powers. I believe that both NOAA and BOEM, the two main federal organizations that are responsible for protecting these amazing mammals, of which there's only 340 individuals left, that these agencies have violated their public trust. They have not done what they're supposed to be doing. And I don't trust them, and I don't think members of Congress should trust them. I think the public should not trust them. We need a proper investigation to get to the bottom of what's going on.
Can you tell us more about how the wind energy industry and the oversight, the governmental institutions have responded to the claims you make in this documentary?
They have not responded. They have not responded yet. We are going to take our findings to them with members of Congress, because I absolutely do not trust these agencies. We talked to scientists in these agencies who have been raising the alarm. I should point out that last year, a senior scientist with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is called NOAA, sent a letter warning that there could be population-wide effects on the North Atlantic right whale, and by which he meant extinction. He was ignored and overruled by his superiors, who are jamming this project forward. Similarly, all of the major environmental groups sent a letter 2 years ago raising the exact same concerns, and they were overridden by their bosses, who are dead set on having these huge industrial wind projects off the eastern shore. So we are going to go to them with our data. We have two sets of data. It's the acoustics data, and it's also the boat data, which shows this correlation with the wind deaths. But we're going to do it with members of Congress, because these, in my view, these federal agencies are sources of disinformation and I'm using that very strong word deliberately here. I believe that they're deliberately misleading the public about the risk to these whales. They've overridden what their own scientists have been saying. I frankly think this is a shameful experience. I'm personally, as you can tell, quite outraged by it. I think anybody that cares about these magnificent animals, of which there's only 340 left, should be very concerned about what we document in this film.
It seems that on average, about 25 whales are beached on the East Coast per year. And what is notable here is that there's been an increase. So that in this past year, it went up to 60 whales, if I understand what the data here. And the allegation is that these wind turbine, the construction of these wind turbines is the correlation here. But my understanding is also that the wind turbines started to be constructed back in 2016, and the spike has only come about this year. So is there any explanation for why there seems to be a gap between the construction of these and the existence of the wind turbines and the spike this year, which does seem to be notable from years past?
We actually, in the research we show, and it's in the documentary film, we show that there has been an increase and a strong correlation to those periods of wind industry activity going back to 2017. As you noted, there's been 60 recorded whale deaths, I should say, since December of last year. So obviously the year's not is up yet. So that's over 60 this year. Where they call it an unusual mortality event. They raise all sorts of issues. These things are always multifactorial. But I think the important thing to remember is that when you have so few individuals in a species remaining, 340, and I think one of the arguments, and I think honestly this is one of the subtexts that nobody wants to say, is I think that there's some people that have given up on the species. They think it's inevitably going to go extinct. We don't think so. We think it can come back, but that means that you can have no more impacts. So sometimes people say, hey, maybe climate change, the warming waters is moving the whales into new hunting grounds. That could be the case. People might say there's other factors. There's been fishing, other boat activity. Absolutely. But that's all the more reason that you would not want to add all this additional boat activity and all of this very high decibel sonar activity, because it's adding additional stressors. This is not very complicated science at a certain level. When you get what they call cumulative impacts on a very critically endangered, vulnerable population like this, you very well may end up with extinction. But I'm very confident in this data. We actually have a second research project that's ongoing that correlates this. Honestly, it's outrageous that we've seen that we are able to, that we as kind of amateur researchers, we've got an amazing team, but nonetheless, it's kind of shocking that it had to be turned to citizen scientists and citizen journalists to track this when it's really been the responsibility, and there's been millions of dollars spent on supposedly trying to study whether or not there's a correlation here.
But Michael, I'm sorry, but isn't that part of the issue? If there's multifactorial causes here, and one of the main leading causes of whale death is global warming, particularly with Arctic species that are more affected by these kinds of things. And wind turbines are geared toward addressing exactly that problem, getting us off of the fossil fuels that are causing global warming in the first place. How do you reconcile the obvious broad national global interest in moving away from fossil fuels, including for the sake of animals, but also for human beings, against the impact that they may or may not be having on this particular population of whales?
Well, I mean, the first thing is to say that we see a very strong correlation between the industrial wind activity and these whale deaths. So there is definitely a baseline of harm against these whales. There's no doubt about it. That's an argument for no additional harm against the whales, no additional what they call incidental harassments or takes of these whales. On the issue of climate change, the obvious solution is to do what we've been doing over the last 10, 15 years, which is switching from coal to natural gas and also doing nuclear. It's worth pointing out that the amount of electricity they expect to get from these industrialized wind farms is less than from a single nuclear power plant. And thanks in part to Representative Ocasio-Cortez and others, they shut down Indian Point nuclear plant in New York a couple of years ago. They replaced it 1-to-1 with natural gas. Massachusetts shut down a nuclear power plant. So if you, so I don't think, as an environmentalist and a conservationist, I don't think we should have to choose between these two worthy goals. I don't think that as part of dealing with climate change, we should accept the extinction of a whale species. I think that's by definition having lost the plot.
But Michael, as part of the rationale, however you felt about it, of shutting down the nuclear power plant in AOC's district, was that the waste from that nuclear plant was going into the water supply and having an adverse effect on, among other things, marine life. So again, if you discovered that nuclear power plants were similarly having an effect on whales, is that an argument for now shutting down nuclear power plants? I'm just trying to figure out where this ends logically.
Yeah, I mean, certainly all energy production has side effects, but nuclear waste going into the water is not one of them. That was definitely not happening at Indian Point or any other nuclear plant.
It's not that it's nuclear waste; it's that runoff. I'm just trying to figure out where this. If you discovered that nuclear power plants were similarly having an effect on whales, is that an argument for now shutting down nuclear power plants? I'm just trying to figure out where this ends logically.
Yeah, I mean, certainly all energy production has side effects, but nuclear waste going into the water is not one of them. That was definitely not happening at Indian Point or any other nuclear plant.
It's not that it's nuclear waste. It's that runoff. The warm water that they use to cool the plants, generally speaking, is discharged, causing algae blooms and the oxygen level of the water to increase significantly in a way that throws off the entire ecosystem.
Yeah, that is not what happened. It did not have anything like ecosystem effects of what you're describing. In many nuclear plants around the world, the very slightly warmer water that comes out of the plant attracts marine life. It actually attracts manatees in Florida. It actually attracts sea lions and seals in California. But in any event, that slightly warmer water is very easy to mitigate. It is by no means reason to shut down those plants. It is not toxic at all. The algae blooms, my understanding is that for the most part, those algae blooms have been a result of lack of proper sewage treatment, not the nuclear power plant. So I agree there's trade-offs, but in this case, I think it's a pretty, from an environmental point of view, a pretty easy decision to keep your nuclear plants operating.
Last question for you. So I'm probably coming at this from a different angle than Brianna. I would like to protect endangered species of whales. I'm probably willing to do that up to a point. Obviously, Earth has had a lot of species, right, that no longer exist, that went the way of the dinosaur for reasons that have sometimes nothing to do with human involvement. I don't know. I certainly wouldn't agree that like a certain state of the way things were on the planet should be conserved no matter the cost, like on a philosophical level. I wouldn't support that. I want to protect the species to the extent it's possible and is not an inordinate waste of our own resources, but past a certain point, I would be okay with it. So, what is, I guess, from a big picture standpoint, what is the argument that we should, handicap our ability to use different energy sources or cleaner energy sources or cheaper energy sources out of a concern for what is a couple hundred members of a species, not a species I want to suffer or want gotten rid of, but there's reasonable, and then does it go past a point where it's like, okay, you're a panda, you're not breeding, we can only do so much.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think there's definitely been an argument within the environmental movement over whether or not these species are priceless and really no price is too high in order to conserve them. There's other people that try to do a cost-benefit analysis. But I think it's important to remember, Robbie, that in this case, the cost of these industrialized wind projects is being supported by the American taxpayer. We're paying around a third of the cost of subsidizing these industrial wind turbines. They are not financially viable to be built without the subsidy. As Warren Buffett famously said, that's the whole point, is to get the subsidy. So without subsidies, there would be no industrial wind farm. Without basically them repressing the best available science, they would not be able to build this project. And you're right. I mean, there's definitely some background extinction of species. I myself have criticized the idea that we're in a mass extinction. We're not. At the same time, I think that most people have an emotional reaction to these whales because they are such magnificent, ancient, large mammals. They have behaviors that we I think, find very sympathetic and are marvels to see. I don't think I can make a rational argument, actually, for saving whales. I just think, Robbie, you and I will just have to go out in the water and look at some of them, and usually that has enough of an impact to get people to want to save them.
Well, it's also worth noting, we should just say that the stated rationale, there was a negotiated decommissioning of the Indian Point plant that they agreed to. The concern specifically were the placement of the plant next to so much densely populated area. Specifically, there had been an alarming incident after another, one after another, including missing and damaged bolts on the structures in both reactors that surround and are critical to cooling nuclear fuel. A May 2015 transformer fire sent thousands of gallons of oil into the Hudson River. Radioactive spills and releases into the Hudson River and groundwater, failed accident drills, and inadequate disaster planning. The fact that the unit was within a mile of a significant seismic zone was also one of the reasons that led to decommissioning that plant, while another plant was open. So I'm not in no way against nuclear power, but there were specific public health and environmental reasons that that plant was shut down. And I think that people are going to have to reconcile whether or not the cost benefit of various forms of new energy are worth it. The whales could be infected by a lot of these different kinds of things. So thank you so much for bringing this story to us, Michael.
Thanks for having me, guys.
For years,